Okay, so let's talk about the argument from last time. Let's finish it up. So, did you guys guess what the problem was? Well, the problem is this seems like a pretty much textbook example of the fallacy of false choice. This seems like a false dichotomy, right? Look, there are a lot of things we can do between legalizing all drugs and just keeping drug laws as they are. I think Boaz does a pretty good job showing that current drug laws are, for lack of a better way to put it, pretty messed up. Does he show that we should legalize drugs? No, he doesn't. Does he show that we should exclude these other alternatives that are somewhere between keep them like they are or entirely legalize drugs? No, I mean, he doesn't. So I think the question then is, if we should change drug laws, and I think Boaz does a good job showing that we should, how should we change them? The question then is repeal or reform. Now, maybe this isn't a blanket question. Maybe we should legalize some drugs and reform our enforcement with others. You know, I'm inclined to think maybe we should legalize marijuana. I'm not sure what the harms of it really are. Look, it's not completely safe. There are some links with cancer. There are some other health effects. But is it really that bad? Does it really do that much damage? I'm not sure there's an argument for it. But Boaz wants to legalize everything, right? Do we really think that Boaz has shown that we should legalize heroin, meth, acid, all that stuff? I don't think he has, and I would like to consider maybe when it comes to the harder drugs, definitely reform and some possible reforms. Okay, two reforms or two sorts of reforms I think might work pretty well in light of what Boaz says are targeted enforcement and shorter sentences. Well, what do I mean by targeted enforcement? Well, look, as things stand now, drug dealers have no incentive not to be violent. One thing that targeted enforcement means, and some cities have experimented with this, Durham, North Carolina experimented with it for a while, is that you leave most drug dealers alone, but you really go after the violent ones. You put all your effort after them. That gives drug dealers an incentive not to be violent. If you're violent, the police will come after you. If you're not, well, they'll leave you alone, subject to some conditions. Another thing that targeted enforcement means is that we don't allow open air drug markets. Open air means openly selling in a neighborhood. Now, a lot of social science research suggests that open air drug selling does a lot of damage to a neighborhood, that it's very bad. But targeted enforcement means, well, we'll go after drug dealers who are violent, we'll go after drug dealers who sell it in the open, but those who keep it out of sight and aren't violent, we'll mostly leave alone. I think targeted enforcement, it has the promise of remedying a lot of the bad parts of the current war on drugs, of current drug laws, without also bringing all the ills of full-on legalization. Think about the opioid crisis, right? If you think full-on legalization is a good idea, think about the opioid crisis. That wasn't even legalized, it just became easier to prescribe these drugs for a while, and, you know, doctors were encouraged to. Think about how bad it's gotten. If we full-on legalize drugs, the opioid crisis has happened even with restrictions. Imagine if we legalize heroin. Imagine if we legalize methamphetamine. I think it would be very bad, but I don't think we have to remedy the problems with the current war on drugs. targeted enforcement might be one remedy. We won't have the ills of full-on legalization, but we will deal with some of the problems of our current drug policies. Targeted enforcement also means, frankly, that we would put less effort into enforcing drug laws. Be a less important part of our agenda. But think about it. Well, evidence seems to show that heavy enforcement doesn't do a lot more to discourage drug use than lighter enforcement. Wouldn't it be a smart use of resources to go with targeted enforcement, to go with less enforcement? Deal with the drug dealers who are a problem, let the others alone, right? Now, of course, you might say, well, the ones who we leave alone, they're still going to be doing damage by dealing drugs. But I think, we've got to strike a balance between deterring usage and using resources badly. Targeted enforcement would allow us to strike that balance, and, we would discourage drug use, drugs would be more expensive, and we wouldn't waste so many resources. Another reform I think we could make is just to give drug dealers shorter sentences. There's not much evidence that longer sentences do a lot to deter drug selling. I think Boaz is right about that. One of the reasons is criminals just don't think about the consequences of getting caught very much. Criminals, the criminological research suggests, they think a lot about whether or not they'll get caught. They don't think about what happens afterwards. So very long sentences, especially for non-violent drug dealers, that just strikes me as, again, a use of resources. So maybe if we really shorten sentences for drug offenses, we could get deterrence without so much in the way of resources, and also without the damage that putting people in jail for such long times does. So I think Boaz makes, with his second argument, I think he makes a very good argument for some major reforms in our drug policy. Targeted enforcement, shorter sentences are two reforms that I think are very attractive. Does Boaz show we should legalize drugs? No. And his argument for legalizing drugs, I think, is fallacious. It commits this fallacy of false choice. Well, Boaz has one final argument for drug legalization. Let's look at that one. So Boaz's final argument for legalization, and I think, this might work even if we can show legalization would have some bad consequences, is just a full-on anti-paternalist argument. There might be some bad consequences for legalizing drugs, but Boaz would say our fundamental rights are more important than bad consequences, and we have a fundamental right to do what we want with our own body. So Boaz's argument would go like this. We have a fundamental right to do what we want with our own body. Part of that right is to put whatever we want in our bodies. Drug laws interfere with that right, so drug laws are wrong. Even then, Boaz would say if we could deal with the way that drug laws have bad consequences or lead to the violation of other fundamental rights, even with reform, we might get rid of a lot of the laws that allow police to seize people's property for such a long period of time. Boaz would say, well, no, even if we got rid of that, you're still violating a fundamental right. You're violating a fundamental right to do what you want with your own body. Okay, so Boaz will say, where do our rights end? Well, only where other people's rights begin. What this means for Boaz is the only reason you can put some kind of restriction on my behavior is if that behavior actually harms another person. So Boaz very much subscribes to the harm principle, the negative harm principle. The only reason to restrict people's behavior is if it actually harms somebody else. Now, Boaz doesn't give us an argument for this. I think he probably would go with a Kantian argument. Boaz is very much a libertarian. he very much thinks we have strong rights to our own bodies. And we'll talk about, when we talk about Nozick in the next unit, I think Boaz would reach for an argument like Nozick's. So no patience for paternalism or any other liberty-limiting principle. The only one for Boaz is the harm principle. Well, but Boaz has a rather particular take on the harm principle. Boaz says we shouldn't restrict people's behavior just because it might harm others or even because it's likely to. We should only restrict behavior when it actually harms others. And Boaz will say, look, in particular about drugs, why, if I could do the drug responsibly, if I would enjoy doing it, and I wouldn't harm others when I do it, why punish me? Why keep me from doing the drug because some other people won't do it responsibly? And look, Boaz has a bit of a point here. Even for hard drugs like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, it actually turns out that most people who use them are not going to be problem users. The science on the drug debate actually will talk about more about problem users than addicts. Addicts is just a blurry term. But, problem users, people who will develop some kind of problem from use, even really addictive drugs like heroin, like amphetamines or cocaine, only about 30% of people who try them will go on to develop problems. 70% of people who do the drug won't develop problems. So Boaz will say, a large minority, yes, but only a minority of people who use the drug will develop problems, will end up harming others. Well, why punish those who would use the drug responsibly because others might not? And if you think about Mill, when he talks about drug use, he has a similar thing. He's like, well, look, if someone proves to me that he can't do a drug without harming others, maybe we'll say he can't do it. Mill would say maybe somebody who has proven that amphetamines or whatever, meth will lead him to harm others, or cocaine, alcohol, maybe we could, as part of his punishment, say, well, he can't do it anymore. But why say that the rest of us who might do it responsibly, why say we can't do it? So Boaz would say, well, you can't talk about likely harms, you can only restrict behavior that actually harms others. Well, first glance, that seems pretty compelling, right? Drug laws based on possible or likely harms, those are just off the books. If we buy the negative harm principle, it's a question whether we do, but if we do, Boaz would say no restrictions because of likely harms, only restrictions because of actual harms. Well, do we buy that or not? Seems convincing. Let's think about it a little more. I think for Boaz's version of the harm principle, it's pretty easy to come up with counterexamples. Boaz says, well, we can't put restrictions on behavior for likely harms, only actual harms. Well, think of what this would mean with, say, laws for speeding, right? If Boaz says, well, you can only put restrictions for actual harms, well, why tell me that I can't do 90 miles an hour down the highway because some people can't? If we buy Boaz and Mill's interpretation, well, likely harms are no reason. For drugs, well, apply that to traffic laws. You should let people do whatever speed they want on the highway until they prove they can't responsibly do that speed. That seems kind of silly to me. The fact that we are very likely to do harms to others doing 90 down the highway, that seems like a reason to stop it before the harm occurs. Well, then you might say, if you're Boaz, well, who are you to stop me from doing drugs? If I want to do cocaine or methamphetamine, or I want to drop acid, who are you to stop me? Because others might not do it responsibly. But here's a question I would ask you. Are all sacrifices of freedom equal? If you say to me, oh, you can't do cocaine, or you can't do amphetamines, or you can't do heroin, how much of a sacrifice in an important freedom is that really giving up? How important is it to most of us to do cocaine or heroin or whatever? Well, if it's really that important to you, you might well be an addict. And is there really much reason to put restrictions on addicts doing a drug, right? You know, putting a restriction on what drugs we're allowed to use, well, that seems to me a lot more trivial restriction than putting a restriction on who we can marry. Or, you know, what we can do for a career. If sacrifices of freedom for drugs really will prevent big harms to others, well, is that so unacceptable? I'm not so sure it is. And the thing is, even though most users of even hard drugs can do them responsibly, for the people who don't, they do pretty big harms, right? And if you're Mill or Boaz, I want to return to a question I asked about the harm principle to start with. If I harm myself, are those harms really only limited to me? I don't think they are. And I'm not going to require you guys to read it, but I'm going to put up an article about the opioid crisis after these slides. And look, the people who do harms to themselves by doing opioids, they seem to do massive damage to those who care about them. So you say to Boaz, it's like, well, if I'm only hurting myself, what business is it of yours? Well, a lot of times by hurting ourselves, we end up doing harms to others. So at least when it comes to drugs, or at least hard drugs, for most people, I'm not so sure that these fundamental rights to do what we want with our own body, well, not every fundamental right to do what you want with your own body is as important as others. Is the one to sell drug or do drugs, is it really that important? I don't know. I don't think so. Now, if you have a special reason for wanting to do the drug, if some Native American groups, peyote or other hallucinogens are part of their religious rituals, that's a much more important reason for wanting to do the drug than, oh, I just like getting high, right? So that might be a bigger limitation in freedom. It's interfering with their practice of the religion. If we just say to people, oh, you can't get high, is that as big a limitation on freedom? I'm not so sure it is, and I'm really suspicious when Boaz wants to blur all limitations of freedom together and pretend they're all equally important. I don't think they are, and I think given the harms drugs do, some restrictions on drugs might be entirely justified. Now, we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about the really hardcore libertarian argument that we should have these rights to our own body that Nozick throws out in the next section. So we will revisit this issue when we cover Nozick. But for now, at least for the last one, I don't think Boaz makes his case, and if he doesn't make his case for the last one, then ultimately I don't think he makes his case for full-on drug legalization. Even if he might, and I think he does, make a very good case for reform in drug laws.